The Texas sun hung low and merciless over the sprawling landscape, casting long shadows across the dusty plains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The year was 1885, and the land bore the scars of a harsh summer, cracked earth, withered grass, and the constant buzz of flies that seemed to follow every living thing under the relentless sky. James Mitchell rode his black stallion through the outer reaches of his vast ranch, the Double M, one of the largest cattle operations in all of Texas. At 35, he had built an empire from nothing, transforming thousands of acres of wild frontier into a profitable enterprise that employed over 50 men and ran nearly 10,000 head of cattle. His weathered hands gripped the reins with the confidence of a man who had never known failure, and his steel-gray eyes surveyed his domain with the calculating gaze of someone who controlled everything within his sight. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson, and James knew he should head back to the ranch house soon. His foreman, Carlos Mendez, would be waiting with the daily reports, and there were contracts to review for the upcoming cattle drive to Kansas City. But something had been nagging at him all day, a restless feeling that kept him riding further from home, deeper into the remote corners of his property. It was then that he heard it. A sound so faint it might have been the wind, but different somehow, more purposeful, more human. James pulled his horse to a stop and listened intently. The sound came again, a soft clink, like metal against metal, barely audible over the whisper of the evening breeze through the sparse mesquite trees. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt, 45 at his hip, as he urged his stallion forward, following the sound toward a small grove of oak trees that provided one of the few patches of shade in this desolate stretch of land. What he found there defied everything he thought he knew about his own property. Chained to the largest oak tree, her wrists bound with heavy iron shackles, was a woman. She couldn't have been more than 25, with dark hair that hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, and skin that bore the angry red marks of too much sun and too little water. Her dress, or what remained of it, was torn and stained, hanging in tatters that barely preserved her modesty. Her feet were bare and bloodied, and every visible inch of her body told the story of recent violence and prolonged suffering. But it was her eyes that stopped James cold. They were the deepest brown he had ever seen, almost black in the fading light, and they held an intelligence and intensity that seemed to burn right through him. As their gazes met, those eyes conveyed a message clearer than any words. Don't speak. Don't call out. Don't make a sound. James's first instinct was to shout, to demand answers, to ask who had done this to her and why. But something in her expression, a desperate, pleading quality that spoke of fear beyond anything he could imagine, made him pause. Instead, he dismounted slowly, his boots crunching softly on the dry leaves as he approached her. Up close, the extent of her injuries became more apparent. The shackles had rubbed her wrists raw, and he could see the marks of rope burns on her ankles where her feet had apparently been bound as well. There were bruises on her arms in the distinctive pattern of fingerprints and a cut on her lip that had scabbed over but still looked fresh. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, forgetting her silent plea for a moment. "What happened to you?" The woman's eyes widened in alarm, and she shook her head frantically, glancing around as if expecting someone to emerge from the gathering shadows. James followed her gaze, suddenly aware that whoever had done this to her might still be nearby, might be watching even now. He reached for the key ring on his belt, finding the universal key that fit most standard shackles, a necessity for any rancher who dealt with the occasional escaped prisoner or traveling criminal. The chains fell away with a metallic crash that seemed to echo across the prairie, and the woman immediately collapsed, her legs too weak to support her weight. Without thinking, James caught her in his arms, feeling how light she was, how her body trembled with exhaustion and fear. She looked up at him again, and this time her eyes held a different message. "Thank you, but we're not safe yet." The sound of approaching hoofbeats in the distance made the decision for him. 3 riders were coming fast across the plain, their horses kicking up clouds of dust that were visible even in the fading light. James didn't need to see their faces to know they meant trouble. No one rode that hard across open country unless they were chasing something or running from something. "Can you ride?" he asked the woman quietly. She nodded, though James could see the effort it took for her to remain conscious. He helped her to her feet, then lifted her onto his horse before mounting behind her. Her body was tense as wire, and he could feel her trembling against him as they rode toward the main ranch, taking a circuitous route through the low hills that would keep them hidden from the approaching riders. The ride to the Double M ranch house took nearly an hour, and during that time the woman never spoke a word. She seemed to slip in and out of consciousness, her head occasionally falling back against James's chest before she jerked herself awake again. Each time she would look around desperately, as if trying to determine where they were and whether they were still being followed. The ranch house came into view just as full darkness settled over the land. It was a large 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wraparound porch and windows that glowed warmly with lamplight. Smoke rose from the chimney, and James could see several of his men moving about the property, tending to the evening chores. Carlos Mendez was waiting on the porch, his weathered face creased with concern. At 52, Carlos had been James's foreman for nearly a decade, and in that time he had learned to read his boss's moods and needs with uncanny accuracy. The sight of James returning after dark with an injured woman in his arms told him everything he needed to know about the kind of evening they were about to have. "Senor Mitchell," Carlos said, hurrying down the porch steps. "What happened? Is she hurt?" "Get Dr. Harrison," James said, dismounting carefully and lifting the woman down from the horse. "And Carlos, tell the men to keep their eyes open tonight. We might have visitors." Carlos nodded grimly and disappeared into the house, shouting orders to the other ranch hands. James carried the woman inside, noting how she seemed to relax slightly once they were surrounded by thick stone walls and solid doors. He took her to the guest room on the first floor, a comfortable space with a large bed and windows that looked out over the courtyard. As he laid her gently on the bed, she grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes met his again, and this time the message was crystal clear. "They're coming. They'll never stop coming." "Who?" James asked quietly. "Who's coming?" But the woman's eyes had already closed, and she slipped into unconsciousness just as Dr. Harrison arrived with his medical bag. Dr. William Harrison was a short, stout man in his 60s who had served as the local physician for nearly 20 years. He had seen everything the frontier could throw at a person, from gunshot wounds to snake bites to the various diseases that plagued both cattle and the people who worked with them. But even he seemed taken aback by the condition of the woman James had brought home. "Good God, James," he muttered as he examined her injuries. "This woman has been through hell. These wounds, some of them are days old, maybe weeks. And these shackle marks." He shook his head. "I've seen this before. Human trafficking. Some of the worst kinds of people you can imagine." James felt a cold fury building in his chest. "Can you help her?" "I can treat her injuries, but she's going to need time to heal, and I suspect her emotional wounds run deeper than anything physical." Dr. Harrison began cleaning and dressing the worst of her cuts. "Where did you find her?" "Chained to a tree on the north section of my property. There were riders coming. I think they were looking for her." Dr. Harrison's expression grew grave. "Then you need to be very careful, James. The kind of people who do this to another human being, they don't give up easily. They'll come looking for her, and they won't hesitate to go through you to get her back." As if summoned by his words, Carlos appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Senor Mitchell," he said quietly, "there are 3 men at the front gate. They say they're looking for a runaway slave girl, and they have papers that give them the right to search any property in the territory." James's jaw tightened. Slavery had been abolished for 20 years, but there were still men who operated in the shadows, trafficking people under various pretenses. Runaway wives, indentured servants, debt prisoners. The legal system was complex enough that a man with the right papers and enough money could make almost any claim stick, at least long enough to get what he wanted. "Tell them I'll be right there," James said. "And Carlos, make sure the men are armed and ready, but don't start anything unless they do." Dr. Harrison looked up from his work. "James, be careful. If they have legal papers—" "I don't care what papers they have," James replied, his voice hard as granite. "No one chained this woman to a tree legally, and no one's taking her from my property without a fight." As James walked toward the front door, he could hear the woman stirring behind him, murmuring something in her sleep. He paused at the doorway, looking back at her. Even unconscious, her face showed the strain of whatever she had endured, and he found himself wondering what her story was, what had brought her to that tree, and why her eyes held such desperate secrets. The men at his gate were waiting, and James could already tell this was going to be a long night. But as he stepped out onto the porch, he made a silent promise to the woman lying in his guest room. Whatever it took, whoever these men were, they would not be taking her anywhere. The confrontation that awaited him would test everything he believed about justice, mercy, and the responsibilities that came with power. But James Mitchell hadn't built an empire by backing down from a fight, and he wasn't about to start now. Chapter 2. The Confrontation. The 3 men waiting at the front gate of the Double M Ranch were exactly the type James had expected. Hard-faced, well-armed, and carrying themselves with the casual arrogance of men who had never been told no by anyone who lived to repeat the experience. The leader was a tall, lean man with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, wearing a black coat despite the evening heat. His companions flanked him like guard dogs, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. James walked down the porch steps slowly, deliberately, his own hand never straying far from his Colt. Behind him he could sense rather than see his ranch hands taking positions around the property. Carlos had trained them well, and they knew how to make themselves useful without starting a war. "Gentlemen," James said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who owned everything as far as the eye could see. "I understand you're looking for someone." The scarred man smiled, but it was the cold, predatory expression of a shark. "Name's Donovan. "These are my associates, Pike and Garrett. We're looking for a runaway, and we have reason to believe she might be on your property." He produced a folded document from his coat pocket, holding it out for James to see. "Legal papers signed by a federal judge. We have the right to search any property in the territory for our missing asset." James took the papers, noting immediately that they were freshly printed and bore several official-looking seals. But he also noticed that the woman was described only as Maria Santos, age approximately 25, brown hair, brown eyes, approximately 5'4" in height. No photograph, no detailed description that would distinguish her from thousands of other women in Texas. "Says here you're looking for someone who ran away from her employer in El Paso," James said, handing the papers back. "That's a long way from here. What makes you think she'd come to my ranch?" Donovan's smile widened. "Runaway slaves, I mean indentured servants. They tend to head for the biggest ranches thinking they can hide among the workers. Your spread is pretty well known in these parts." The casual way he had said slaves told James everything he needed to know about what kind of operation these men were running. The woman in his guest room wasn't an indentured servant or a runaway wife. She was a victim of human trafficking, probably one of dozens that these men had bought and sold over the years. "Well, gentlemen," James said, his tone remaining polite but firm, "I'm afraid I can't help you. I haven't seen anyone matching that description, and I'd appreciate it if you'd remove yourselves from my property." Pike, the shorter of the two companions, stepped forward aggressively. "Now hold on there, mister. We got legal papers that say we can search." "You have papers that say you can search for a specific person with a specific name," James interrupted. "But you don't have a warrant and you don't have probable cause. This is private property and I'm telling you to leave." Donovan held up a hand to calm his companion, but his eyes never left James's face. "Mr. Mitchell, isn't it? We've heard about you. Built quite an empire out here. Be a shame if something happened to it." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. James felt the familiar cold anger settling over him like a comfortable coat. "Are you threatening me on my own property, Mr. Donovan?" "Not at all. Just making conversation. But you know how it is out here. Accidents happen. Cattle rustlers, Indian raids, brush fires. A man can lose everything in a single night if he's not careful." From the shadows around the ranch house, James could see the subtle movement of his men. Carlos had positioned them well. If this turned into a gunfight, Donovan and his men would be caught in a crossfire with no cover. But James also knew that once bullets started flying, people died, and he wasn't ready to start a war over a woman he had just met. "I appreciate your concern for my property," James said, "but I think you gentlemen should be moving along. The road to El Paso is long, and you'll want to get an early start in the morning." Donovan's facade of politeness finally cracked. "Listen here, you arrogant son of a bitch, we know she's here. We tracked her to this area and there's nowhere else she could have gone. So why don't you just hand her over and we'll be on our way? I told you I haven't seen anyone matching your description. Then you won't mind if we take a look around." James's hand moved to his gun. "Actually, I would mind, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to insist that you leave. Now." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Donovan's men had spread out slightly, giving themselves better angles for a gunfight, and James could see the calculations running behind their eyes. 3 against 1 seemed like good odds, but they hadn't counted on the dozen ranch hands who were now clearly visible in the shadows, all armed and ready. "This isn't over, Mitchell," Donovan said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "We know she's here and we'll be back. Maybe next time we'll bring more men. Maybe next time we'll bring the law." "You're welcome to try," James replied, "but I'd suggest you make sure your paperwork is in order. And gentlemen, if I see you on my property again without an invitation, I'll consider it trespassing. And in Texas, a man has the right to defend his property." Donovan and his men mounted their horses, but the scarred man couldn't resist one final threat. "You have no idea what you're getting into, Mitchell. That woman isn't some innocent victim. She's property, and valuable property at that. The people who own her don't take kindly to theft." With that, they rode off into the darkness, their horses' hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. James watched them go, noting the direction they took and mentally calculating how long it would take them to reach the nearest town, where they could hire more men. Carlos approached from the shadows, his rifle still in his hands. "They'll be back, Senor Mitchell, and next time they'll bring help." "I know," James said. "Double the night watch and make sure everyone stays armed. And Carlos, send word to Sheriff Williams in town. I want him to know what's going on." "See, Patron, and the woman?" James looked back toward the house, where warm light spilled from the windows. "She stays, whatever it takes." Inside the house, Dr. Harrison was finishing his work on the woman's injuries. She had awakened briefly during the confrontation outside, and James could see the fear in her eyes as she listened to the raised voices. "How is she?" James asked. "Stable, for now, but she's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and exhausted. These injuries, James, some of them are from whips, others look like burns. This woman has been tortured." James felt his anger flare again. Can she travel? Not for days, maybe weeks. Moving her now could kill her. Dr. Harrison packed his medical bag. But I heard what those men said outside. They're not going to give up. Then we'll have to make sure they don't get her back. The woman's eyes followed their conversation, and James could see the intelligence behind them, the way she was processing every word despite her weakened condition. She understood that her presence was putting everyone at the ranch in danger, and the guilt was clearly eating at her. James sat down in the chair beside her bed. "What's your name?" he asked gently. She looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, "Elena. Elena Rodriguez." Her voice was hoarse from disuse and thirst, but there was strength in it, a core of steel that had somehow survived whatever hell she had endured. "Elena," James repeated. "Those men who were here, they're the ones who hurt you." She nodded, then whispered, "They'll kill you. They'll kill everyone here to get me back." "Let me worry about that," James said. "Right now you need to focus on getting better. Dr. Harrison says you need rest and time to heal." "You don't understand," Elena said, struggling to sit up. "They don't just want me back. They want to make an example of me, of anyone who helps me." "What happened to you? How did you end up chained to that tree?" Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I was sold by my own uncle after my parents died. Sold to a man named Castellanos who runs women, girls. He ships them all over the territory, to mining camps, cattle towns, anywhere men have money and no questions." James felt sick. "And you escaped?" "I tried. 3 times. Each time they caught me and..." She gestured to her scars. "The 3rd time, Castellanos decided I was too much trouble. He sold me to Donovan, told him I was a troublemaker, and he could do whatever he wanted with me." "The tree?" "Donovan said he was going to leave me there until I died. Said it would be a lesson to the other girls about what happens when you try to run." Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've been there for 3 days, no food, no water. I thought I was going to die." James reached out and took her hand, surprised by how small and cold it was. "You're safe now, I promise." "No," Elena said, shaking her head. "No one is safe, not while they're out there. They have connections, money, men who will do anything for the right price, and they'll never stop coming. Then we'll have to stop them first," James said. Elena stared at him, searching his face for something. Sincerity, maybe, or the kind of strength that could back up such a bold statement. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you risk everything for a stranger?" James was quiet for a moment, considering the question. He thought about his own past, about the father who had abandoned him and the mother who had died when he was barely 15. He thought about the years of struggle, building his ranch from nothing, fighting off cattle rustlers and crooked businessmen and anyone else who thought they could take what was his. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because no one should have to go through what you've been through." Elena closed her eyes and James could see the exhaustion overtaking her again. "They'll come back," she whispered. "Maybe not tonight, but soon. And when they do, we'll be ready," James said. "Get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning." As Elena drifted off to sleep, James stood by the window looking out at the dark prairie. Somewhere out there, Donovan and his men were planning their next move. They would be back, probably with more men and better weapons. And when they came, James would have to decide just how far he was willing to go to protect a woman he barely knew. But as he watched Elena sleep, seeing the way her face relaxed for the first time since he had found her, James knew he had already made his choice. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would not let those men take her back to the hell she had escaped. The war for Elena Rodriguez had begun, and James Mitchell intended to win it. Chapter 3. The siege dawn came slowly to the Double M Ranch, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and pink that belied the danger hanging over the property like a storm cloud. James had barely slept, spending most of the night pacing the halls and checking on the defensive positions Carlos had established around the ranch house. Every shadow, every sound of the wind through the mesquite trees, every distant cry of a coyote had him reaching for his gun. Elena had slept fitfully, crying out in her dreams, and then jerking awake with a look of terror that gradually faded as she remembered where she was. Dr. Harrison had left laudanum for the pain, but she had refused it, saying she needed to stay alert. James understood. When you had been hunted as long as she had, the luxury of unconsciousness was one you couldn't afford. The first sign of trouble came at sunrise, when Carlos approached the house with a grim expression and a steaming cup of coffee in his weathered hands. "Senor Mitchell," he said, his voice tight with concern, "we have a problem. During the night, someone cut the telegraph wires. We can't send word to town." James accepted the coffee gratefully, feeling the caffeine hit his system like a shot of whiskey. "How many men do we have?" 12 on the ranch right now. The rest are out with the herds, but it would take hours to recall them. Carlos paused, studying James's face. "There's something else?" "Miguel found horse tracks around the north pasture. At least a dozen riders, maybe more. They're surrounding us." The news wasn't unexpected, but it still sent a chill down James's spine. Donovan hadn't been bluffing when he said he would bring help. The question was how many men he had managed to recruit and how far they were willing to go. Any sign of the law? James asked. Nothing. If Donovan has the kind of connections the señorita says he does, he might have convinced the authorities to look the other way, or maybe he's paying them to stay out of it. James nodded grimly. In the isolated areas of Texas, the law was often whatever the man with the most guns and the most money said it was. And if Donovan was connected to a large trafficking operation, he would have resources that James couldn't match. What about the women and children? James asked. There were several families living on the ranch property, wives and children of his workers who had made the Double M their home. Already moved them to the root cellar behind the main house. It's stone construction, good protection from bullets, but Senor Mitchell, Carlos hesitated. Some of the men are getting nervous. They signed on to work cattle, not fight a war. I understand, James said. Any man who wants to leave can go. No questions asked, no hard feelings. None of them want to leave, Patron, but they're scared, and they have families to think about. James set down his coffee cup and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful morning scene that masked the danger closing in around them. How long do you think we can hold out? If we're careful with ammunition and water, maybe 2 days, but that's if they don't try to burn us out. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the morning air, and James saw a single rider approaching under a white flag. It was Donovan, but this time he was dressed like a respectable businessman, complete with a clean suit and a badge pinned to his lapel. Son of a bitch, James muttered. He's got himself appointed as some kind of deputy. Carlos spat in the dirt. A badge bought and paid for, no doubt. Elena appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but under her own power. She had washed and changed into clothes that Mrs. Mendez had provided, a simple blue dress that highlighted her natural beauty, despite the healing cuts and bruises on her face. That's him, she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. That's Donovan. James put a protective hand on her shoulder. Stay inside, don't let him see you. He knows I'm here, Elena said. He's not going to leave without me. Donovan reined in his horse about 50 feet from the house, well within shouting distance, but far enough away to avoid being an easy target. Mitchell, he called out. I want to talk. James stepped onto the porch, his rifle cradled in his arms. You're on my property without permission, Donovan. Say what you came to say and get out. I've been deputized by the Federal Marshal's office to recover stolen property, Donovan called back, patting the badge on his chest. I have legal authority to search your premises and arrest anyone harboring a fugitive. Let me see your warrant, James replied. Donovan held up a folded document. Right here, signed by Marshal Thompson himself. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time. Hand over Maria Santos, and we'll be on our way. I told you before, I don't know anyone by that name. Then you won't mind if we search the property. James noticed the way Donovan said we. A quick glance around the property revealed men moving into position in the trees and behind the outbuildings. They had been surrounded while he was talking. I'm afraid I can't allow that, James said. This is private property and I have the right to refuse entry to anyone I choose. Not when they're harboring a fugitive, you don't, Donovan replied. And Mitchell, resisting a federal deputy is a hanging offense. So is human trafficking, James shot back. Donovan's false smile faded. You're making a mistake, a big one. I've got 20 men out there, all legally deputized. You've got maybe a dozen ranch hands with old rifles and too much loyalty. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed. You're right, James said. It doesn't. You can turn around and ride away and we'll forget this ever happened. Last chance, Mitchell. Hand over the woman and I'll let you and your men live. James raised his rifle, pointing it directly at Donovan's chest. Get off my property. Now. Donovan's face twisted with rage, but he wheeled his horse around and rode back toward the tree line. You've got 1 hour to reconsider, he shouted over his shoulder. After that, we come in shooting. As soon as Donovan was out of sight, James called his men together. They gathered in the main courtyard, a mix of experienced ranch hands and younger men who had never faced anything more dangerous than an angry bull. You all heard what he said, James began. We're outnumbered and they claim to have legal authority. Any man who wants to leave can go right now, no questions asked. Old Pete, the ranch's cook and unofficial storyteller, stepped forward. Begging your pardon, Mr. Mitchell, but we ain't going nowhere. We seen what they did to that poor girl, and we ain't about to let them take her back. A murmur of agreement ran through the group. Carlos nodded approvingly. We stand with you, Patron, but we need a plan. James had been thinking about that all morning. They've got us surrounded, but they don't know the layout of the property as well as we do. Carlos, take 4 men and get up into the bell tower of the chapel. You'll have a clear view of the entire area. Si, Patron. Miguel, you and Jose take the barn. It's stone construction, good cover, and you can cover the north approach. Pete, you and Tom take the bunkhouse. Everyone else spread out around the main house. Make every shot count. We don't have ammunition to waste. As the men dispersed to their positions, Elena approached James, her face pale but determined. "This is my fault," she said. "They're here because of me. You should stay inside and let us handle this," James interrupted. "This isn't your fault. This is what happens when good people stand up to evil. But your men could die because of me." James turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense. "Elena, those men out there, they're not just after you. They're after the idea that they can take whatever they want, whenever they want, from whoever they want. If we let them win here, how many other women will suffer what you've suffered?" Elena was quiet for a moment, processing his words. "What can I do to help?" "Stay alive," James said simply. "And when this is over, help us make sure they never hurt anyone else again." The hour passed slowly, with both sides watching each other across the dusty courtyard. James could see Donovan's men moving into position, and he estimated their numbers at closer to 15 than 20. Still overwhelming odds, but not impossible. At exactly 1 hour, Donovan's voice rang out across the property. "Time's up, Mitchell. This is your last chance." James's response was to fire a single shot over Donovan's head, the crack of the rifle echoing across the prairie. It was a clear message. Come and take her if you can. The battle for the Double M Ranch began with a hail of gunfire from the trees, bullets whistling through the air and chipping stone from the house's walls. James's men returned fire methodically, picking their targets carefully and making each shot count. From his position on the porch, James could see the tactical situation developing. Donovan's men had superior numbers and position, but they were attacking a fortified position defended by men who knew every inch of the ground they were fighting on. The siege had begun, and James knew that before it was over, both sides would pay a heavy price. But as he thought about Elena, about the scars on her body, and the terror in her eyes when she spoke of her captors, he knew that some prices were worth paying. The war for Elena Rodriguez had escalated, and James Mitchell was prepared to fight it to the bitter end. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. The gunfight raged for 3 hours under the merciless Texas sun, turning the peaceful courtyard of the Double M Ranch into a war zone. Bullets whined off stone walls, splintered wooden beams, and kicked up geysers of dust from the hard-packed earth. The acrid smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mixed with the coppery scent of blood and the fierce sweat of men fighting for their lives. James crouched behind an overturned wagon, his rifle barrel hot to the touch from repeated firing. Across the courtyard he could see Carlos in the bell tower, methodically picking off Donovan's men with the precision of a man who had learned to shoot during the border wars. The old foreman's steady presence was a comfort to the younger men, who looked to him for guidance when the bullets flew too close. But James could see they were losing ground. Despite their defensive advantages, Donovan's men were pressing closer, using the outbuildings and trees as cover to advance toward the main house. 2 of James's men were already down. Miguel had taken a bullet in the shoulder, and young Tommy was nursing a grazed scalp that bled freely down his face. "We can't keep this up much longer," Carlos shouted from the bell tower. "They're getting too close." James knew his foreman was right. They were running low on ammunition, and Donovan's men seemed to have an endless supply. Worse, he could see smoke rising from the direction of the barn. Someone had managed to set fire to the hay stored there, and the flames were spreading rapidly. Inside the house, Elena paced the floor of the guest room like a caged animal, flinching every time a bullet struck the walls. She had helped Mrs. Mendez tend to the wounded, her small hands surprisingly steady as she cleaned and bandaged wounds. But James could see the guilt eating at her. Every man who bled, every cry of pain was because of her. "I have to stop this," she said suddenly, moving toward the window. James caught her arm. "Elena, no. You go out there and this was all for nothing. But your men are fighting for something they believe in," James said firmly. "Don't take that away from them." A new sound cut through the gunfire, the thunder of approaching horses. James's heart sank as he saw at least 10 more riders approaching from the south, their horses lathered with sweat and their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Reinforcements," Carlos called out, his voice grim. "We're finished." But as the riders drew closer, James saw something that made his heart leap. The lead rider was wearing a star-shaped badge, and his horse bore the distinctive markings of the Texas Rangers. Behind him rode a full company of Rangers, their rifles ready and their faces set in the hard lines of men who had come to settle a score. "Hold your fire," James shouted to his men. "Rangers!" The newcomers reined in their horses at the edge of the courtyard, and their leader, a tall, lean man with prematurely gray hair and eyes like chips of flint, surveyed the battlefield with the practiced gaze of a professional lawman. "This is Captain Sam Houston Morrison of the Texas Rangers," he shouted, his voice carrying easily across the property. "By order of the governor of Texas, I am placing all parties under arrest pending investigation of charges of human trafficking and unlawful imprisonment." Donovan emerged from his cover behind the smokehouse, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "You can't do this. I have legal authority. I'm a federal deputy." Captain Morrison dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun. Mr. Donovan, I've been tracking your operation for 6 months. Your federal deputy badge was purchased from a corrupt clerk in El Paso, who's already confessed to selling false documents. You're under arrest for human trafficking, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. You have no proof, Donovan snarled. I have the testimony of 12 women who escaped from your operation. I have financial records showing payments to corrupt officials. And I have this. Morrison held up a leather-bound ledger. Your own records, detailing the sale and transport of over 200 women and girls over the past 3 years. James felt a surge of relief so intense it nearly knocked him over. Elena appeared at his side, her face a mixture of hope and disbelief. Is it over? She whispered. It's over, James said, putting his arm around her shoulders. But Donovan wasn't finished. With a snarl of rage, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at Elena. If I can't have her, nobody can. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. James saw Donovan's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the hatred in the man's eyes, saw Elena's face go white with terror. Without thinking, James threw himself between them, his body shielding Elena from the gunshot that echoed across the courtyard. The bullet hit him in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. Elena screamed, dropping to her knees beside him as blood spread across his shirt. From somewhere far away, he heard more gunshots, the Rangers putting an end to Donovan's threat once and for all. James! Elena's voice seemed to come from a great distance. James, stay with me. He tried to speak, but blood filled his mouth. The world was growing dark around the edges, and he could feel his strength ebbing away like water from a broken dam. But Elena's face was above him, her dark eyes filled with tears, and somehow that made everything bearable. Why? She whispered. Why did you do that? James managed to find his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Because you're worth it. Because everyone deserves to be free. Dr. Harrison appeared, pushing Elena aside gently as he began working on James's wound. The bullet's still in there, he muttered. I need to get him to a proper surgery. Will he live? Elena asked, her voice breaking. I don't know, the doctor replied honestly. But he's strong and he's got something to live for. Sometimes that's enough. As consciousness faded, James felt Elena take his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. I'm here, she whispered. I'm not going anywhere. The last thing he remembered was the sound of her voice, promising to stay with him, and the warm pressure of her hand in his. Then darkness claimed him, and James Mitchell fell into the deepest sleep of his life. Captain Morrison supervised the arrest of Donovan's surviving men, his face grim as he surveyed the damage. How many casualties? He asked Carlos. 2 of our men wounded, but they'll live. 3 of Donovan's men dead, including Donovan himself. And the woman? Carlos glanced toward the house where Elena sat vigil beside James's unconscious form. She's safe, finally safe. Morrison nodded. It's over then. The trafficking ring is broken, and the women they held captive are free. But the cost? He shook his head. It's always too high. As the sun set over the Double M Ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, Elena sat beside James's bed holding his hand and whispering prayers in Spanish. The man who had saved her life, who had risked everything for a stranger, lay unconscious before her, his breathing shallow but steady. I don't know if you can hear me, she said softly, but I want you to know that I'm going to stay. I'm going to help you rebuild what was damaged here. I'm going to make sure that what you did, what all your men did, wasn't in vain. Outside, the ranch hands were already beginning the work of cleaning up the battlefield, tending to the wounded, and repairing the damage. The war was over, but the real work, the work of healing and rebuilding, was just beginning, and at the center of it all, Elena Rodriguez kept watch over the man who had given her back her freedom, determined to repay the debt she could never fully repay. Chapter 5. The Healing. 3 weeks had passed since the gunfight that had turned the Double M Ranch into a battlefield, and the Texas autumn was painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The bullet wound in James's chest had healed slowly, leaving him weak but alive, a testament to both Dr. Harrison's surgical skill and Elena's round-the-clock nursing. Elena had barely left his side during the worst of his recovery, sleeping in the chair beside his bed and waking at the slightest change in his breathing. She had watched over him with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood the true value of life, having come so close to losing her own. Now, as James sat on the porch of the ranch house, his strength slowly returning, he marveled at how much had changed. The physical damage from the siege had been repaired. New timbers replaced the bullet-scarred beams, fresh paint covered the walls, and the burned barn had been rebuilt stronger than before. But the deeper changes, the ones that couldn't be seen with the naked eye, were far more profound. Elena had transformed from the terrified, broken woman he had found chained to a tree into someone entirely different. Her dark hair, now clean and carefully braided, caught the morning light as she worked in the garden she had planted behind the house. Her face, once marked by fear and pain, now showed the quiet strength of someone who had survived the unthinkable and chosen to build something beautiful from the ashes. "She's quite a woman," Captain Morrison said, settling into the chair beside James. The ranger captain had stayed at the ranch to oversee the investigation and had become something of a fixture around the property. "Yes, she is," James agreed, watching Ellen attend to the tomatoes she had coaxed from the harsh Texas soil. "Any word on the other women?" Morrison's expression grew serious. "We've located most of them. 14 are being returned to their families. 8 have chosen to stay in Texas and start new lives, and 3," he paused, "3 didn't make it. We found their graves near one of Donovan's camps." James felt the familiar anger rise in his chest, but it was tempered now by the knowledge that justice had been served. "What about the men higher up the chain?" "That's where it gets interesting," Morrison said, pulling out a cigar and lighting it carefully. "The ledger we found in Donovan's possession has led us to a network that stretches from California to New Orleans. We've already made 17 arrests, including 2 federal judges and a territorial governor. And the women will testify?" "Elena's already agreed to testify in the federal trials. She's not afraid anymore, James. Whatever you did for her, it gave her back her courage." James watched Elena laugh at something Mrs. Mendez had said, the sound carrying across the courtyard like music. "She did that herself. I just gave her a safe place to heal." "Don't sell yourself short," Morrison said. "What you did here, standing up to Donovan, protecting her when you barely knew her, that took real courage, the kind of courage that's getting rare these days." Carlos approached the porch, his weathered face creased with concern. "Senor Mitchell, we need to talk about the cattle drive. The buyers in Kansas City are getting impatient." James nodded. The practical demands of running a ranch hadn't stopped during his recovery, and Carlos had handled most of the day-to-day operations. But the annual cattle drive to Kansas City was too important to delegate. It represented nearly half of the ranch's income for the year. "How many head are we talking about?" James asked. 3,000. Good quality stock, well-fed and healthy. The buyers are offering top dollar, but they want delivery within the month. James considered this. The cattle drive would take nearly 3 weeks, and he wasn't sure he was strong enough yet to handle the rigors of the trail. But the ranch needed the money, especially after the expenses of rebuilding. "I'll be ready," he said finally. "James," Morrison said quietly, "maybe you should consider staying here. Let Carlos handle the drive this year." "The ranch is my responsibility," James replied. "I can't ask my men to take risks I'm not willing to take myself." Elena appeared on the porch carrying a tray with coffee and fresh biscuits. She had taken over much of the cooking duties from Mrs. Mendez, and her skills in the kitchen were proving to be as impressive as her courage under fire. "You're talking about the cattle drive," she said, settling the tray on the small table between the chairs. "I can tell by the way you're all looking so serious." "It's nothing for you to worry about," James said, but Elena fixed him with a look that had become familiar over the past weeks, the look of someone who had faced the worst humanity had to offer and refused to be dismissed or protected from difficult truths. "I may be new to ranch life, but I'm not stupid," she said, "and I'm not fragile. What's the problem?" Carlos glanced at James, who nodded. "The problem, señorita, is that the patron is not yet strong enough for a cattle drive, but he's too stubborn to admit it." Elena turned to James, her dark eyes serious. "Is that true?" James felt his face flush. "I'm fine. The wound is healing well, and I'm getting stronger every day." "Show me," Elena said. "What?" "Show me you're strong enough. Stand up without wincing. Walk to the end of the porch without getting winded. Lift something heavier than a coffee cup." James started to protest, but Elena held up a hand. "James, you saved my life. You risked everything for me, and I will never forget that. But I won't stand by and watch you kill yourself out of misplaced pride." The words stung, partly because they were true. James had been pushing himself harder than Dr. Harrison recommended, determined to prove that he was back to full strength. But Elena's challenge forced him to confront the reality of his limitations. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "I'm suggesting that you let Carlos handle the cattle drive this year. Stay here, continue recovering, and be ready for next year's drive." "Elena, you don't understand. This ranch will survive 1 year without you personally driving cattle to Kansas City," she interrupted. "But it won't survive if you collapse on the trail and die because you were too proud to admit you needed more time to heal." Morrison chuckled. "I like her, James. She's got more sense than you do." Carlos nodded approvingly. "The señorita speaks wisdom, patron. I can handle the drive. You trained me well." James looked around at the 3 people who had become the most important influences in his life, and he realized that Elena was right. His pride was making him reckless, and his recklessness could cost the ranch everything. "All right," he said finally. "Carlos, the drive is yours. But I want daily reports, and if anything goes wrong, I'll handle it," Carlos said firmly. "Trust me, patron." As the afternoon wore on, James found himself alone with Elena on the porch, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of his property. The silence between them was comfortable, the kind that develops between people who have shared danger and survived it together. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said eventually. "Of course. What are you going to do with the rest of your life?" The question caught James off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've built an empire here. You've got more money than you could spend in a lifetime, more land than you could ride across in a week. What comes next?" James considered this. For years, his only goal had been to build the ranch, to prove that he could succeed where others had failed, but the shooting had given him a new perspective on what really mattered. "I don't know," he admitted. "What about you? What are you going to do?" Elena was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about that. Captain Morrison says there are other women out there, other victims of trafficking rings, women who need help, who need someone to speak for them. You want to help them? I want to do something meaningful with the second chance you gave me. I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to other women." James felt a surge of admiration for her courage. "That's dangerous work. The people involved in trafficking, they don't give up easily. I know, but I also know that silence is what allows evil to flourish. If I don't speak up, if I don't fight back, then I'm still letting them win." They sat in comfortable silence again, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. James realized that Elena was right. He had been so focused on building his empire that he had forgotten to think about what he wanted to do with it. "Elena," he said suddenly, "would you stay? Not just for the trials, but permanently." She turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "Why?" "Because I think we could do good work together. You want to help other women, and I have the resources to make that possible. We could turn part of the ranch into a refuge, a place where women can heal and learn new skills." Elena's face lit up with interest. "You would do that?" "I would do that. With you." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. James realized that what he was proposing wasn't just a business partnership, it was a life together, a future built on shared values and mutual respect. "James," Elena said softly, "I need you to know something. What happened to me, what they did to me, it changed me. I'm not the same person I was before." "None of us are the same people we were before," James replied. "But that doesn't mean we can't build something beautiful with who we are now." Elena reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Yes," she said simply, "I'll stay." As the Texas night settled over the Double M Ranch, James Mitchell and Elena Rodriguez sat together on the porch, holding hands and planning a future that neither of them could have imagined just a few weeks before. The cattle baron who had discovered a beautiful woman chained to a tree had found something more valuable than all his land and livestock combined. He had found a partner, a purpose, and a love that would last the rest of his days. The story of their meeting might have begun with chains and violence, but it would continue with healing, hope, and the kind of love that emerges when two people choose to build something beautiful from the ashes of their past. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, and Elena smiled, no longer afraid of the sounds of the night. She was home, finally and forever, and the future stretched out before them like the endless Texas sky, full of possibility, full of promise, and full of love. The end.